So, Joe, Los Conductos, what did you think?
Really enjoyable film. Very strange and unusual. I like the 70s aesthetic, and the first 10 minutes or so, particularly, was really steeped in cinema. I felt there was an early shot of a hand in the frame with the handgun, and the way he kind of draws and talks about that gun in a sort of adolescent way seemed very Godardian to me. And there's a lot of really stark shadows and spare framing in those early sequences that was almost kind of German expressionism. There's that really lovely shot where he pairs the shot of the bullet in the human body with the hose going into the petrol tank of the motorbike, which was seemed almost like a reference to Zigo Vertov. There was a moment where the guy, that kind of antagonist, keeps stealing his cigarettes and he threatens him and throws him out of that workplace, where he's standing there with his shirt off with his kind of blank, expressionless face that looked to me like a reference to Jean Genet. And so it seemed very, very elusive, the film. The obvious parallel, I think, is to the Hodorowski's kind of trippy quest movies, and it also felt to me a bit like like The Warriors or some urban road movie of the 70s. So I really enjoyed how rich it was to begin with. um, it lost some of that and then moved into this kind of poetic parable, which I found interesting but jarred a little bit with the final shot is that poem which talks about how society is destroying Colombia's young men. And I felt like I found that a bit jarring, because I thought if the film was supposed to be a political parable, it could have done so much more straightforwardly and forcefully. Uh, and I didn't realize that this was the point it was making. The film seemed, up until that point, far more concerned with a kind of poetry than anything else. Um, I really enjoyed the inexpressive performances, made the kind of obscure nature of the plotting all the more absorbing. And I liked the central conceit, which is that the most dramatic part of the plot, him joining this cult and killing the cult leader father, has already happened when the film opens, and we are told about it in voiceover, while the actual action of the film, for the most part, is really simple. It's often images of people doing things, blowing up balloons and printing T-shirts, while the narrator tells us stuff in voiceover. And I thought that was a really interesting, unsettling kind of technique that ordinarily you might expect that whole narrative, the story of him joining the cult and conflict therein, forming the film. But instead, they focus on this sort of repetitive images of people at work, which I really enjoyed. There was something kind of meditative and interesting about that. Quite simply, or deceptively simple, the way the film is put together, both through those straightforward shots. Oftentimes, just a really long shot with a long like voiceover over the top, sometimes telling us quite complicated stories, like the story of Nut, the guy who gets stabbed and then finds God, and then that seems to repeat itself later on. We see either a recreation of that story or a sort of reformulation of it, and that pattern is repeated towards the end, where he meets that guy who calls himself Revenge, and it's unsure what their relationship is, and perhaps he's a kind of reincarnation or psychological reformulation of the father character, but again far more kind of poetic and suggestive than an obvious parable. So I really enjoyed it. I thought it was a very interesting, unusual uh, movie. Yeah, it's cool.
Yeah, I think I kind of agree with everything that you say, actually, but I think I perhaps have more mixed feelings about this film than you. Um, all the things that you say you liked, I really liked as well. I've, the aesthetics right from the start, the grainy film. Um, I don't know how you tell when you're watching a film that's like grainy old film, whether it's actually shot on old film or whether it's a digital effect. But anyway, it looked it looked very effective, and right from the titles, it visually it really grabbed me. Um, I do think that aesthetically, this film is an artwork. It's if this film was just running in a gallery, I mean, I've talked about this before, you know, about whether a film is a film that's an artwork, whether it's best to watch it in a cinema or or see it in a gallery. And I think that this film would work very well in a gallery. You know, you don't need to start at the beginning and watch it through to the end. I think in that was my kind of feeling about it, that, you know, actually if you walked into it in the middle of it, and in a gallery and just sat and started watching it, it's, you know, the images are immediately arresting throughout the film. I think, you know, aesthetically it works very well. In terms of it being a kind of feature film, I really liked the uniqueness of the way that action shots were presented. You know, as you mentioned, the shooting at the beginning of the film, where we don't actually see the incident happen. We see the torchlight and the way the light moves. We then see the shooters breathing, just standing there breathing, and then as you say, it focuses on the bullets, and I really liked that. I think it's, you know, the technique is using sound. It's the sound that tells us what's going on, and then it shows us almost incidental things which fill in the pieces. And, you know, we don't actually need to see all of the actual action. You know, when he steals the bike with the rock, we see him with a rock in his hand, we hear a thud, and we hear the bike driving away. We know exactly what's happened. When he's riding along on the bike, there's a shot where we don't see him riding the bike. We just see a strange angle of the trees at the side, but we hear the bike noise, and so we know he's riding the bike. You know, there was multiple times when this happened, and I thought this was a very effective way of presenting action, you know, in a kind of non-obvious way. I enjoyed, you know, the film was very quirky and mysterious. I was, you know, it's difficult to know what's going on at many points. And for the most part, I enjoyed that. I was enjoying it, but, you know, there's things that I just loved in it that did feel like they went beyond just being aesthetically interesting and were parts of the film. And like you, I kind of noticed that there was possibly repetition, but I wasn't sure. You weren't sure the order that things were happening in, or whether we were seeing something again that we'd already seen. And I liked all of that. One thing I really loved about this film was that the first dialogue was 11 minutes into the film, and I hadn't noticed that there wasn't any dialogue. I think the film was so kind of rich in content that dialogue was not necessary. And actually, I hadn't, you know, it was only when he spoke that I realized that, you know, I hadn't been hearing any dialogue. And I think that was very, you know, given that there were some action scenes that could easily have had some dialogue in them, I thought that was really, really interesting. You know, the film achieved that. The first conversation between, there's not many conversations in this film, but the first conversation, as you say, when he steals the cigarettes, is 20 minutes in, you know, and so that was very effective for me. You know, obviously, as the film evolves, you're hoping to have some idea. I was hoping to have some idea of understanding something of what the film was about. And, you know, obviously it's about some kind of cult, and it's about connection between people finding connection. It's about crime. It's about an underworld. There's something about addiction in there. For the most part, it kept me interested, but with about 20 minutes to go. So this is quite a short film, isn't it? Again, 70 minutes. With about 20 minutes to go, I felt it was losing me. I lost. I was losing interest in it. It didn't keep me involved in it, in terms of it being like a feature film that I was going to watch through to the end, it always was working for me as an artwork, as something interesting to look at, full of interesting images. But yeah, so I think it's a really interesting issue that I have spoken about before, about, you know, the difference between a feature film and a video artwork, and when you get a work that's straddles both sides of the line, wherever it is. I do think that's interesting, and I think that this, as a video artwork, for me, this film was very successful.
Yeah.
As a feature film, I'm less convinced, because it lost me. It lost me for the last 20 minutes. Um, I almost feel like I would like to watch it again to see if I missed something, but to be honest, I don't know whether I've got the patience to sit through it again. I also was a bit, I found that ending very clunky, to give us that quote, and, you know, that quote of, when will Colombia stop killing its sons? Because compared to how obscure and uncertain and mysterious the whole film was, that just seemed so obvious, and it gives, you know, it then kind of gives us a meaning to the whole film. I agree with what you were saying, that if that was the purpose of the film, I think, rather than having the quote at the end, maybe just making it a little bit more obvious in the film. But it doesn't feel like that's what the film was suggesting to me. But then at the end, that it's telling me in a very explicit way that that's what the film is about. And yeah, I found that clunky, and I think you said jarring. Yeah, I agree with that. But so, you know, real mixed feelings on this one. I don't think it quite succeeds, even though there were things that I really, really liked about it.
Yeah, yeah, interesting. I think I kind of agree with you. I don't think you missed anything, and I understand that it works. It works on the level of, like, as a mood piece more than anything else, and it is a really interesting issue, isn't it? This idea of where something most naturally sits. I suppose in this instance, a few minutes in, it became reasonably clear that this wasn't going to be a conventional narrative film. It wasn't going to tick the kind of boxes that cinema might tick. That it was going for something different, a kind of poeticism and elegiac kind of suggestive nature, and it is the sort of film you can kind of dip into and out of. But I didn't mind that, and I guess it doesn't really occur to me to wonder where it most naturally sits. I suppose once I've just sort of found the rhythm of the film, I can either enjoy it or not, you know. But I think you're right. It wouldn't seem out of place at all in a dark room somewhere that you just sort of wander in, watch for 10 minutes, wander out again. But I don't necessarily see that as a drawback. I think if you go there expecting, you know, a thrilling, exciting kind of movie, or even something that, you know, is more obviously psychologically structured and all the rest of it, then you'll probably be disappointed. But as long as you recognize fairly soon that that's not the kind of film you're experiencing here, then I don't think I necessarily see it as a problem. But yeah, I mean, it is interesting, isn't it? It basically comes down to this idea of, is a film cinematic or not? By which we mean, are we prepared to pay 10 quid to go to the cinema, sit down and watch a film, expecting to be entertained? And I always think, really, that the only answer to that is that we ought to sort of judge works on their own terms. And if the film is not trying to be that, then I think that's fine. But there is almost a suggestion that there's something inappropriate, or that it's importunate to say, for the film to demand to be a cinematic film that, you know, is going to be distributed in theatre and shown in theatres, as though there's something inappropriate about a film that makes those demands upon an audience without giving them what they expect. So it's quite a complex issue, really.
Yeah, I mean, I think that for at least half of this film, probably two-thirds, I was really satisfied with it as a feature film to be seen in the cinema. I mean, visually, it's stunning. So seeing it on a big screen, definitely, in a, you know, is, at some level, I do agree. It doesn't really matter. whether it's a cinema or an art gallery. But I think I was disappointed that because it felt quite experimental and quite original in the way that it was presenting the action, and it felt, yeah, it just felt really, really original. And I I was, yeah, the characters, when the dialogue that did take place, the kind of deadpan way in which that took place, and that often the characters were facing into the camera when they were speaking, and it did feel really original as a feature film. I just don't think it didn't keep me engaged in that way. It kind of lost its way in terms of bringing that to some kind of resolution, because I think as a feature film, it came close to being pretty amazing, actually, but didn't quite make it.
I see what you mean. So yeah, I think I'd agree with that. And then I suppose towards the end, it sort of it pays more attention to the kind of aesthetics and tone and atmosphere of something you might more readily find in a gallery, right? Rather
Yeah.
than paying as much attention to the kind of beats and structure of a more conventional narrative film. I think I'd broadly agree with that, actually. Yeah.
Yeah. I really loved that scene where it showed us these leaves and they were red, and he was kind of staring, or we saw him staring at something. We assume he's staring at these red leaves, and then they suddenly turn green, the leaves, and we hear the bike driving away, and you realize that the leaves were red because of the brake light from the bike.
Right.
And then when he takes the brake light off and starts moving, it's shot at night, this, so, but the leaves return to this dark green, and I just found that stunning. So there were things in this film that I really loved. The scene where there's an angry dog and we don't actually see the dog, we just see the hand of the owner, and we see the rope pulling, and we hear this dog. I thought that was, really, really effective. And I just wish that, it had somehow come to its resolution in a way that kept to that, level of interest, really. So, but worth seeing, would you say?
Yeah, definitely
Yeah,
worth seeing. Yeah,
me
and
too.
a
Yeah,
filmmaker who's worth paying attention to. He's clearly going to do interesting stuff.
definitely.
Yeah.
What are we watching next?
Next up is a film called Something Useful by a Turkish filmmaker called Pelin Esma.
Great.